March the 14th, 1944. Gestapo headquarters in Lyon, France. SS Sturmbannführer Klaus Barbie stood before a wall-sized map of southern France, red pins marking recent sabotage incidents across the Auvergne region. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and printer ink from the intelligence reports stacked on every available surface. Over the past 6 weeks, 17 supply convoys had been ambushed, 4 rail lines destroyed, and an entire ammunition depot reduced to rubble. Behind Barbie, 3 Gestapo officers reviewed wanted posters and surveillance photographs, their voices carrying the frustrated edge of men who'd been chasing ghosts for months. Hauptsturmführer Werner Schulz lit another cigarette and laughed bitterly at the photograph pinned to the intelligence board. It showed a glamorous woman in a Parisian café taken years earlier. Beneath the image, typed in bold letters, La Souris Blanche, 5,000 francs. Schultz addressed the room with theatrical sarcasm. Gentlemen, we're being made fools by a woman who probably ran back to England months ago. 5 million francs for someone who's likely sipping champagne in Mayfair, while we chase rumors across every hilltop in France. The other officers nodded. Obersturmführer Hans Dietrich added his assessment. Our informants report this White Mouse commands entire resistance groups. Impossible. Women make excellent couriers, adequate radio operators, but military command of armed forces? Physiologically implausible. Combat stress alone would incapacitate a female within days. More laughter. Barbie himself raised his glass in sardonic toast. To the legend of La Souris Blanche. When we finally catch this mouse, she'll turn out to be nothing more than a messenger delivering orders for the men who actually lead these operations. Then, what Klaus Barbie didn't know was that at that precise moment, Nancy Wake sat in a forest clearing 30 kilometers south, coordinating ammunition distribution to 7,000 Maquis fighters spread across the Auvergne Mountains. The Australian-born SOE agent had parachuted into France just 2 weeks earlier, landing in a tree and immediately telling the local resistance leader to cut out the French nonsense and get her down. She was 31 years old, carried no documents, used no radio, and operated from memory alone. In the 14 days since her arrival, she'd already coordinated 3 successful attacks on German positions, distributed 40 tons of weapons dropped by RAF aircraft, and personally led a raid on a fuel depot that destroyed enough gasoline to immobilize an entire motorized battalion. The Gestapo's 5 million franc bounty was the highest price ever placed on an Allied agent's head, but Wake's actual value couldn't be measured in currency. She commanded more fighters than most Wehrmacht colonels, and she did it while leaving absolutely no trail for Barbie's detectives to follow. Within 48 hours of that meeting in Lyon, Wake's forces would attack the German garrison at Montluçon in a coordinated assault involving over 700 fighters, inflicting casualties that would force Barbie to request reinforcements he couldn't spare. German counter-resistance doctrine, perfected since 1940 across occupied Europe, represented the most sophisticated intelligence operation in military history. Every protocol had been written in the blood of captured resistance fighters, each procedure refined through successful operations that systematically dismantled underground networks from Warsaw to Amsterdam. The Gestapo's radio detection vans could triangulate transmission locations within 15 minutes, a capability developed after breaking the Belgian resistance in 1941 when operators transmitted for too long. Informant networks blanketed occupied territories with paid observers, established after Dutch resistance cells were infiltrated through cafe owners who reported suspicious conversations. Document checkpoint protocols caught 97% of forged papers implemented after Czechoslovak operations were stopped at borders. The average resistance network survived 8 to 14 months before Gestapo infiltration led to mass arrests. These weren't arbitrary procedures. They were mathematical certainties, backed by 3 years of successful captures. Radio transmissions created trackable electromagnetic signatures. Large organizations required documentation. Command structures needed permanent headquarters. Remove any of these elements, the doctrine stated, and resistance operations became impossible to sustain. The Germans had arrested 2,147 resistance members in France between 1941 and 1943. Their confidence wasn't arrogance, it was earned through systematic victory after systematic victory. While German intelligence officers refined their tracking methodologies, Nancy Wake was proving their fundamental assumptions irrelevant through an approach so counterintuitive it didn't register on Gestapo detection systems. In late February 1944, she coordinated a nighttime weapons drop involving 4 RAF aircraft delivering 80 crates of Sten guns, plastic explosives, and ammunition across 3 separate locations in the Auvergne forests. She violated every German expectation about how such operations functioned. No radio communication, she relied on runners carrying memorized messages and hand signals during face-to-face meetings, scheduled through verbal arrangements made days in advance. No headquarters, she moved sleeping locations every 48 hours, rotating through 17 different safe houses across a 30-kilometer radius. No written records whatsoever. She memorized names, locations, ammunition counts, and tactical plans for what would eventually grow into 7,000 fighters organized into dozens of cells. No hierarchical command structure, she led through personal presence and earned trust rather than formal military rank. The result was an operation the Gestapo couldn't detect because it produced none of the signatures their systems were designed to track. While German radio detection vans scanned frequencies for SOE transmissions, Wake was cycling 20 kilometers through back roads to deliver orders in person. While informants monitored hotels and train stations, she slept in barns and traveled on foot through forests. Her command at this stage encompassed approximately 1,500 Maquis fighters, a force rapidly expanding toward the 7,000 that would make her one of the most powerful resistance leaders in France. Yet, Gestapo intelligence files contained no organizational charts, no intercepted communications, no physical evidence of her network structure. The German response to resistance activities represented the pinnacle of 20th century counterintelligence capability, built on technology that made escape seem mathematically impossible. Funkeabwehr radio detection units could identify an SOE transmission's location within 20 minutes through triangulation from 3 mobile receivers, technology that had resulted in the capture of 43 British agents in 1943 alone. Every agent knew that pressing the Morse key meant starting a countdown to potential death. Average survival time after first transmission was 6 weeks before Gestapo teams kicked down doors and made arrests. The requirement was brutal. Transmit in under 10 minutes, never from the same location twice, except that every message brought capture closer. Simultaneously, informant saturation turned every public space into a surveillance zone. The Gestapo paid 127,000 informants across France, according to captured records, creating a population where every 5th person might be reporting to German intelligence. Train stations had 100% coverage through agents posing as railway workers. Hotels faced mandatory guest registration with information immediately forwarded to local Gestapo offices. Cafe owners endured regular interrogations about suspicious customers. Any behavior that deviated from normal civilian patterns triggered investigation. Carrying large sums of money, unusual travel routes, accent inconsistencies, purchasing quantities suggesting group provisioning. Document control added another layer of impossible difficulty. French civilians faced paper checks 5 to 7 times daily at checkpoints, train stations, and random street inspections. Forged documents were detected through serial number databases, regional paper variations, signature authenticity testing, and ultraviolet ink verification that revealed legitimate government watermarks. The brutal mathematics, Every resistance activity created evidence. Radio transmission equaled location pinpointed. Supply purchase meant merchant interrogated. Safe house meant neighbors questioned. Large gathering meant informant likely present. What Gestapo analysts saw as comprehensive coverage, Nancy Wake transformed into their critical blind spot by operating beneath the detection threshold their systems required. Her most famous evasion came in July 1943, before her SOE training, when she fled Marseille ahead of imminent arrest. The escape required crossing the Pyrenees into Spain, a journey of over 500 kilometers through German-occupied territory, and over mountain passes where temperatures dropped to -10 degrees at night. She made the crossing on bicycle, pedaling 70 to 80 kilometers per day on rural roads while avoiding every checkpoint on the Gestapo's comprehensive inspection network. At 12 separate German roadblocks, she survived through flawless cover story execution, posing as a local farmer's wife visiting relatives, speaking flawless colloquial French with appropriate regional accent, carrying no documents that could contradict her verbal explanation, maintaining weathered appearance consistent with someone who worked outdoors. Her method was revolutionary because it generated no trackable evidence. She refused to use radios even when other agents offered access to scheduled transmissions, understanding that any electromagnetic signature could be detected and triangulated. She carried nothing written that could be discovered during searches, instead memorizing the names, locations, and supply requirements for what would become 7,000 fighters organized across the Auvergne region. She dressed as a peasant farmer, wore no cosmetics, let her hands become calloused from outdoor living so her appearance matched her cover identity. Most critically, she moved constantly, never establishing patterns that informants could report or routines that Gestapo analysts could predict. A classified Gestapo intelligence assessment from February 1944 analyzed the white mouse phenomenon with the systematic thoroughness that characterized German military bureaucracy. The document, stamped Geheim and distributed to senior Abwehr officers across southern France, revealed how completely German intelligence misunderstood what they faced. Subject designation La Souris Blanche represents statistical anomaly inconsistent with established operational patterns for female agents. Analysis of available intelligence indicates the following conclusions. First, female agents historically function as couriers, radio operators, or support personnel, according to documented behavioral assessments conducted on captured personnel, 1941 through 1943. Direct command of military forces by female personnel remains unprecedented in modern warfare. Physiological studies demonstrate female subjects display reduced stress tolerance in sustained combat environments, making command of armed forces implausible beyond theoretical possibility. Second, reported network size estimated between 400 to 800 fighters suggests multiple coordinating leaders employing shared code name for operational security rather than individual command authority. Solo female command of this organizational scale contradicts all behavioral intelligence gathered from interrogations of captured agents. Third, complete absence of radio signature indicates either subject deceased with network operating independently under male leadership or sophisticated relay system utilizing intermediary transmitters we have not yet identified. Option A assessed most probable based on statistical likelihood of female agent mortality in field operations. Fourth, 5 million franc bounty allocation justified by propaganda value of capture, but subject's continued evasion for 18 months suggests significantly diminished operational capacity or withdrawal to England for debriefing and reassignment. Assessment recommendation. La Souris Blanche likely represents composite legend rather than operational individual. Network activities attributed to this designation show coordination patterns consistent with male command structure, using female agent as decoy persona to misdirect investigative resources. Recommend maintaining surveillance protocols while prioritizing infiltration of actual male leadership tier, where command authority demonstrably resides. Conclusion. Female agent, psychologically and physiologically incapable of sustained military command at reported scale. Investigation should focus on identifying male commanders, utilizing White Mouse designation as operational misdirection. The assessment carried the signature of SS Sturmbannführer Heinrich Müller, Gestapo Analysis Division, dated February 18, 1944. It was comprehensive, logical, supported by 3 years of successful intelligence operations, and completely wrong. While Gestapo analysts dismissed her as myth or decoy, Nancy Wake commanded the largest Maquis force operating in southern France, coordinating operations that would prove decisive in disrupting German response to the coming Allied invasion. In March 1944, 1 month after Müller's assessment declared her likely deceased or withdrawn, Wake personally coordinated a series of simultaneous attacks across the Auvergne region, timed to maximize German confusion and resource dispersion. 7 separate Maquis cells struck supply depots in Montluçon, Vichy, and Clermont-Ferrand within a 12-hour window, destroying an estimated 40 tons of ammunition and medical supplies. 3 railway sabotage teams cut telegraph lines and demolished tracks at strategic bottlenecks, forcing German logistics officers to reroute supply trains through longer, more vulnerable routes. 2 communications centers were raided, their radio equipment destroyed, creating intelligence blackouts that lasted 3 days. By this point, she commanded over 7,000 Maquis fighters, organized into autonomous cells, spread across 200 square kilometers of mountainous terrain. She directed these forces from no headquarters, with no radio, carrying no documents that could identify her fighters or reveal their positions. German logistics officers recorded catastrophic losses, but attributed them to multiple uncoordinated partisan bands, unable to conceive that a single commander could orchestrate such widespread operations. Their intelligence maps showed scattered red pins marking attacks, but no connecting lines because they couldn't detect the connective tissue that Nancy Wake provided through personal leadership, memorized coordination, and presence that inspired trust strong enough to make written orders unnecessary. The Germans had made a fatal assumption about the fundamental nature of command itself, believing that military leadership required formal infrastructure rather than personal authority. Their logic appeared sound, according to every military doctrine developed since Napoleon. Effective command required hierarchy with documented chains of authority and written orders specifying responsibilities. Communication systems with radios for tactical coordination and written directives for strategic planning. Centralization through permanent headquarters where commanders studied maps, planned operations, and received intelligence reports. Documentation including rosters of personnel, maps of positions, operational plans specifying objectives and timing. These weren't bureaucratic preferences, but operational necessities. The Wehrmacht couldn't function without these systems. Division commanders needed written reports from regiment commanders, who needed written reports from battalion commanders. Artillery required written fire coordinates. Supply officers needed documented inventories. Therefore, German analysts reasoned, resistance forces faced the same requirements at smaller scale. Large resistance networks mathematically required these same structural elements, or they would collapse into chaos. What they critically overlooked was that command doesn't require infrastructure when it's built on personal authority earned through shared combat and direct presence. Authority came from trust forged through facing danger together rather than from documentation of rank. Coordination happened through face-to-face meetings and memorized plans rather than radio transmissions. Strategy lived in the commander's memory rather than on paper vulnerable to capture. This created an impossible scenario for Gestapo counterintelligence operations. They possessed sophisticated tools for infiltrating formal networks by arresting leaders whose positions appeared on organizational charts, tracking radio transmissions that revealed network structure and locations, raiding headquarters where documents revealed plans and personnel rosters. But they had no methodology for infiltrating trust built through personal courage, demonstrated repeatedly in combat operations. They couldn't track orders delivered in face-to-face meetings and memorized rather than written. They couldn't raid a headquarters that moved every 48 hours and existed only as a sleeping bag and campfire. A specific failed capture attempt demonstrated this operational blindness with devastating clarity. On April 2nd, 1944, Gestapo units surrounded a suspected Maquis command post near Schod's Egg, based on informant intelligence reporting unusual activity at an isolated farmhouse. 20 SS troops established perimeter security before dawn, positioned snipers covering all exits, prepared flashbang grenades for dynamic entry. The raid found an empty building with evidence of recent occupation, including still-warm ashes in the fireplace, food scraps suggesting meals for 3 people, and a sleeping area arranged for extended stay. But Nancy Wake had departed 6 hours earlier, following her standard operational procedure of moving locations every 2 days. Gestapo investigators discovered nothing identifying who had occupied the building. No documents revealing network structure, no maps showing fighter positions, no evidence of command authority or organizational hierarchy. The operational report filed by Sturmbannführer Koch concluded, network structure remains unidentified despite successful location of temporary facility. No evidence of central command authority discovered. Recommend continued surveillance of area for subsequent occupation patterns. Understanding that invisibility came from formlessness made Nancy Wake impossible to capture through conventional counterintelligence methodology. In early May 1944, she demonstrated this principle when Gestapo units raided what informants identified as her current location based on multiple surveillance reports. She detected the approaching operation through network warnings 12 hours before German troops arrived, departed carrying only her personal weapon and 1 change of clothes, left behind nothing but a cold campfire and sleeping bag. The next day, from a location 30 kilometers away, she coordinated a 400 fighter attack on a German convoy transporting fuel to forward positions near Lyon. The ambush destroyed 17 trucks and killed 32 German soldiers, while Gestapo investigators examined the abandoned campsite, finding no maps, no documents, no radio equipment, no evidence revealing who had occupied the position or where they'd gone. This formlessness, replicated across 7,000 fighters, meant that, as her army grew larger, it became proportionally less visible to German intelligence systems designed to detect formal organizational structures. Each fighter knew only their immediate cell leader and perhaps 1 level up the chain. Orders flowed through personal meetings rather than written directives. Tactical plans existed in Wake's memory rather than on paper. Supply distributions happened through face-to-face coordination at weapon drop sites, rather than through documented logistics networks. German intelligence mapped hierarchies, tracked transmissions, infiltrated networks, documented everything. They documented everything except 1 variable. You cannot arrest a commander who exists only in the trust of 7,000 fighters who memorized her orders and carried nothing written. And Nancy Wake commanded from memory, presence, and authority that left no trace to follow. The formlessness that had already frustrated Klaus Barbie in Lyon was only the first of 3 advantages Nancy Wake possessed, advantages that emerged not from superior technology or resources, but from understanding how to fight a war the Germans couldn't recognize as warfare. The Gestapo had built their counter-resistance apparatus on assumptions about how military organizations must function, assumptions forged through successful operations across occupied Europe. They believed resistance required permanent infrastructure, formal communication systems, and documented hierarchies, Nancy Wake was proving that belief fatally wrong. Through methods so counterintuitive they didn't register on German detection systems designed to catch conventional resistance networks. The first advantage came from mobility itself, weaponized against an occupying force that required fixed positions to maintain control. German counterinsurgency doctrine relied on permanent installations, providing overlapping security coverage across occupied territory. Gestapo headquarters in major cities, Wehrmacht garrisons in strategic towns, checkpoint stations along main roads, informant networks based in hotels and train stations. This infrastructure was mathematically necessary according to German military planning. You couldn't control territory without permanent presence. You couldn't gather intelligence without static observation posts. You couldn't coordinate operations without communication centers tied to physical locations. The system worked brilliantly against conventional resistance networks that also required infrastructure, headquarters that could be raided, safe houses that could be infiltrated, radio stations that could be triangulated. But it created a fundamental vulnerability. Every German installation was a known, fixed target. Gestapo officers worked from the same buildings daily. Wehrmacht companies garrisoned the same barracks. Supply depots occupied permanent warehouses. Movement between these locations followed predictable routes on scheduled timetables. The Germans had essentially painted targets on themselves through the infrastructure they considered operationally essential. On April 15, 1944, Nancy Wake demonstrated this mobility advantage through an operation that showcased the 7,000 Maquis fighters now under her coordination. German intelligence had identified her approximate operating area through pattern analysis of recent attacks, concentrating security sweeps across a 30-kilometer radius of suspected activity. What Barbie's analysts didn't realize was that Wake had already relocated her coordination center 50 kilometers northwest, operating from a completely different region while her original area showed no resistance activity whatsoever. From this new position, she coordinated simultaneous attacks on 3 German installations that night. 200 fighters hit a supply depot in Vichy, destroying ammunition stocks. 300 struck a Wehrmacht motor pool near Montluçon, burning 47 vehicles. Another 400 attacked a Gestapo holding facility, liberating 18 resistance prisoners. The attacks occurred across an 80-kilometer front, requiring coordination the Germans believed impossible without radio communication or permanent command structure. Wake achieved it through 5 days of personal travel, cycling between different Maquis cells to deliver memorized orders in face-to-face meetings. While Gestapo units searched empty forests 30 kilometers away, looking for her headquarters, she was coordinating the destruction of German infrastructure from a location they hadn't even considered. After the attacks, she moved again, relocating another 40 kilometers before German forces could triangulate her new position. This mobility, replicated across 7,000 fighters organized into mobile cells, meant that as German security tightened in one area, resistance operations simply flowed around the hardened positions like water, finding new channels. The second advantage emerged from what the Gestapo considered their most powerful weapon: captured documents. German counterintelligence operations depended on discovery of written evidence revealing network structure, personnel identities, operational plans, supply caches. Every successful infiltration of a resistance network since 1940 had followed the same pattern. Arrest one member, search residence, discover hidden documents, arrest everyone named in those documents, repeat. The cascade effect could dismantle entire networks within 72 hours once initial documentation was captured. Gestapo interrogators didn't even need to torture information from prisoners when addresses, meeting times, and names were written in discovered notebooks. This methodology had proven devastatingly effective against every major resistance network in Belgium, Netherlands, and northern France. Captured documents provided irrefutable evidence in courts, justified expanded arrests, and revealed connections between cells that resistance members believed were secure. The German assumption was simple. Organizations of any meaningful size absolutely required written records to function. Supply distribution needed inventory lists. Attack coordination needed written orders. Personnel management needed rosters. Remove documentation, the Germans believed, and organizations larger than a dozen people collapsed into dysfunction. During a May raid on a suspected Maquis safehouse near Clermont-Ferrand, Gestapo units discovered evidence that captured the fundamental difference in Wake's operational method. The building had clearly served as a temporary command post for significant resistance activity. Physical evidence showed occupation by multiple people over several weeks. Food stores sufficient for a dozen fighters. Weapons cleaning materials suggesting regular maintenance of Sten guns and rifles. Maps of the Auvergne region marked with pencil notations. But when German investigators catalogued captured materials, they found 0 documents identifying personnel, 0 written orders revealing future operations, 0 communications revealing network connections. The pencil marks on maps were geographic features, not operational targets. No names appeared anywhere, no addresses, no dates, no operational plans. The lead investigator's report to Barbie concluded with frustrated bewilderment. Site confirms major resistance presence. Cannot determine command authority, personnel identities, or operational intentions. Network scale indeterminable from physical evidence. What the Germans had discovered was the result of Wake's operational security principle applied across 7,000 fighters. If something wasn't in anyone's head, it couldn't be extracted from anyone's head. She memorized supply distribution schedules for 40 separate Maquis cells, never writing down which cell received which weapons. She memorized the first names and physical descriptions of over 200 cell leaders she coordinated directly, never recording their identities. She memorized attack plans, specifying target selection, timing, and fighter allocation, delivering orders verbally during face-to-face meetings. When Gestapo raided positions she'd abandoned, they found empty buildings, or at most generic military supplies. Her command structure existed entirely in memory and personal relationships, making it immune to the document discovery that had destroyed every other major resistance network. The third advantage proved most psychologically devastating to German soldiers: presence replacing communication technology. Wehrmacht doctrine assumed that military command at scale required radio communications. Regimental commanders needed radios to coordinate battalion movements. Battalion commanders needed radios to direct company operations. Without real-time communication, German officers believed, units larger than platoon size became uncontrollable during fluid operations. This assumption was built into every aspect of Wehrmacht training and equipment. Officers carried radio packs. Vehicles mounted radio sets. Even squad leaders had field radios for tactical communication. The Gestapo applied this same assumption to resistance operations. Large-scale coordinated attacks absolutely required radio communications, which created electromagnetic signatures that could be detected, triangulated, and exploited. Every resistance group that attempted operations involving more than 50 fighters had been caught through radio detection within months. Nancy Wake commanded 7,000 fighters conducting multi-cell operations across hundreds of square kilometers without generating a single radio signature that German detection equipment could locate. On the night of June 2, 1944, Wake demonstrated this advantage through an operation that would become legendary among German garrison commanders in the Auvergne. She coordinated a synchronized attack involving over 900 fighters striking 5 separate targets within a 2-hour window. A railway bridge, a telecommunications facility, a fuel depot, a German barracks, and a supply convoy. The Wehrmacht response protocol assumed such coordination required radio communication between attack elements. Detection units scanned frequencies continuously throughout the attack, expecting to intercept resistance transmissions coordinating the operation. They detected nothing. No radio traffic whatsoever on standard resistance frequencies. German intelligence officers initially concluded the attacks were coincidental, rather than coordinated, until damage assessment revealed identical Maquis tactics employed at all 5 locations and timing too precise to be accidental. The interrogation report of a captured Maquis fighter revealed the truth. All coordination had occurred 3 days earlier through personal meetings. Wake had spent 72 hours cycling between cell leaders, delivering attack orders verbally, specifying exact timing using synchronized watches borrowed from RAF supply drops, coordinating withdrawal routes through memorized instructions. On the night of the actual attacks, she was personally present at the railway bridge operation, leading 200 fighters in the assault. German forces attempting to respond found themselves fighting an enemy that coordinated perfectly despite generating no detectable communications. Radio detection vans scanned empty frequencies, while resistance fighters executed plans delivered entirely through human presence and memory. The psychological impact on German officers was profound. They were fighting an enemy that violated every operational assumption their doctrine considered fundamental truth. German technical superiority on paper meant nothing in operational reality, a fact Wehrmacht logistics officers were documenting through increasingly alarmed reports forwarded to Berlin. The disparity between theoretical capability and practical effectiveness was becoming impossible to ignore. On one side, the German counterinsurgency apparatus represented the most sophisticated security system ever deployed. Gestapo headquarters in Lyon employed 147 intelligence officers, analysts, and interrogators. Regional Wehrmacht commands assigned 17,000 troops to security operations across the Auvergne alone. Checkpoint systems processed an estimated 30,000 civilian movements daily through documentation verification. Radio detection capabilities covered 90% of occupied territory with triangulation stations. Informant networks paid 127,000 individuals for intelligence reports. The cost in Reichsmarks was staggering. Personnel salaries exceeded 2 million Reichsmarks monthly. Equipment maintenance and operational expenses added another 3 million. Ammunition expenditure for security operations consumed 500,000 rounds per month. Fuel for vehicle patrols, aircraft reconnaissance, and rapid response units cost 800,000 Reichsmarks monthly. Total expenditure for counter-resistance operations in southern France alone, approximately 6.3 million Reichsmarks per month, or 75 million annually. Against this massive investment, Nancy Wake and her 7,000 Maquis fighters represented a cost structure so minimal it seemed impossible they could threaten German control. RAF supply drops provided weapons and ammunition at no cost to the resistance. Maquis fighters received no salaries, operating for survival and liberation rather than payment. Equipment consisted of whatever could be scavenged, stolen, or parachuted. No uniforms, no vehicles, no permanent installations requiring maintenance. Communication happened through personal meetings, costing nothing but time and bicycle travel. Total British investment in Wake's operation: approximately £40,000 for parachuted supplies over 6 months, equivalent to 480,000 Reichsmarks. The cost ratio was 25-1, Germans spending 25 Reichsmarks trying to suppress resistance for every 1 Reichsmark equivalent Soviets spent enabling it. Yet German casualty reports and damage assessments told a devastating story. Resistance operations were inflicting damage far exceeding their cost. Wehrmacht logistics documented the destruction of 112 vehicles, 47 tons of ammunition, 63,000 liters of fuel, and infrastructure damage requiring 8 months and 3 million Reichsmarks to repair. German casualties from resistance operations in Wake's area of operations: 372 killed, over 600 wounded. Meanwhile, Gestapo had achieved precisely zero captures of Wake's command structure and arrested fewer than 100 Maquis fighters, most of whom were replaced within days through continued recruitment. These statistics were embodied in Nancy Wake's operational record, with numbers that seemed implausible until verified through multiple sources. In the 68 days since her parachute landing in late April, she had coordinated 43 separate operations involving her 7,000 fighters. That averaged one major operation every 1.6 days, a tempo Wehrmacht commanders considered impossible for resistance forces to sustain. The operations included 17 supply convoy ambushes, 11 infrastructure demolitions, 8 German installation raids, and 7 major coordinated attacks involving multiple cells. Total German casualties directly attributable to operations she coordinated. Estimated 520 killed or wounded. Material losses: over 300 vehicles destroyed or disabled, 80 tons of supplies destroyed or captured, 60 kilometers of railway and telegraph line demolished. The German response had required diversion of 2 additional Wehrmacht battalions from frontline service to security duties, removing 1,600 soldiers from defensive positions where they were desperately needed as Allied forces advanced after D-Day landings. Wake's force had effectively pinned down a German division worth of troops through harassment operations that cost the resistance almost nothing in resources. She personally participated in 16 combat operations, leading attacks on 4 separate German installations. Her leadership style, based on personal courage demonstrated repeatedly in direct combat, attracted continued recruitment. Maquis cell leaders reported that Wake's presence during planning meetings and her willingness to lead assaults personally inspired confidence that kept fighters committed despite German reprisals. Her 7,000 fighters represented more combat power than most German regimental commanders controlled, achieved through personal leadership rather than formal military infrastructure. Wehrmacht logistics officers were recording a pattern that should have been impossible according to every military economic theory. The cost to suppress Nancy Wake's resistance operations exceeded the cost of a frontline division by 3 to 1, yet produced a fraction of the combat power. German expenditure attempting to stop her 7,000 Maquis, over 75 million Reichsmarks annually when accounting for personnel, ammunition, equipment, and operational costs. British investment enabling her operations, under 1 million Reichsmarks equivalent annually. The cost-benefit ratio was catastrophic for German logistics. Every Reichsmark Britain invested in Wake's operations forced Germany to spend 75 Reichsmarks attempting to counter it. This was textbook asymmetric warfare, forcing an economically superior enemy to exhaust resources fighting an opponent who barely consumed any. Wehrmacht analysts calculated that the resources dedicated to suppressing resistance in southern France could have equipped and maintained 2 additional panzer divisions, combat power desperately needed on the Eastern Front where Soviet forces were advancing relentlessly. Yet, withdrawing troops from counterinsurgency would allow resistance operations to expand further, threatening rear area security essential for supply lines supporting frontline forces. The Germans were trapped in a strategic dilemma created by a 31-year-old Australian woman who commanded through memory, moved constantly, and left no documentary trail to follow. Nancy Wake personally represented this asymmetric efficiency with numbers that defied belief when Wehrmacht intelligence finally compiled her assessed impact. Conservative estimates suggested German forces had fired over 2 million rounds of ammunition attempting to kill Maquis fighters under her command, with her personally targeted in at least 40 separate Gestapo operations. At 50 Reichsmarks per rifle round or pistol cartridge, that represented 100 million Reichsmarks expended in ammunition alone. Aircraft reconnaissance, dedicated to locating her headquarters, consumed approximately 20,000 liters of aviation fuel monthly at 5 Reichsmarks per liter, totaling 600,000 Reichsmarks over 6 months. Personnel costs for Gestapo officers and Wehrmacht soldiers assigned specifically to counter-resistance operations in her area. 43 million Reichsmarks annually. Total German investment attempting to capture or kill one woman and suppress her 7,000 fighters, approximately 150 million Reichsmarks. Result, she survived, continued operations, and the Maquis grew stronger. Her operations destroyed German material, conservatively valued at 80 million Reichsmarks, and killed or wounded enough German personnel that replacement and medical costs exceeded 15 million Reichsmarks. She represented negative return on investment for German security operations, costing them far more to fight than she cost Britain to enable. The 5 million franc bounty on her head, once considered extravagant, now seemed economically justified if her capture could end this resource hemorrhage. But the 7,000 fighters she commanded weren't following written orders from a headquarters that could be raided. They followed personal loyalty to a leader they'd fought beside, a command structure that couldn't be dismantled through Gestapo methods designed for conventional resistance networks. German high command was beginning to realize that killing one woman leading 7,000 Maquis was costing more than that woman was costing the British. And Nancy Wake had no intention of stopping. As German high command grappled with the resource drain caused by resistance operations in southern France, Gestapo intelligence was about to deliver a revelation that would force them to confront assumptions they'd held since the occupation began. The pursuit of La Souris Blanche had consumed 18 months, 5 million francs in bounty offers, and countless investigative resources. Barbie's files in Lyon contained hundreds of reports, surveillance photographs, and informant testimonies. But one critical piece of information had remained frustratingly elusive: confirmation of the White Mouse's actual identity and current operational role. German intelligence knew she existed, knew she'd escaped France in 1943, suspected she'd returned with British SOE training. What they didn't know, and couldn't accept when evidence finally emerged, was the scale of what one woman had accomplished. The breakthrough came not through Gestapo investigation, but through battlefield intelligence that couldn't be dismissed or rationalized away. On June 22, 1944, Wehrmacht forces captured 3 Maquis fighters after a firefight near Montluçon. Standard interrogation focused on immediate tactical intelligence, unit strength, weapon locations, planned operations. The captured fighters, expecting torture, revealed only names and basic information under initial questioning. But when the interrogating officer asked about their command structure, all 3 prisoners gave the same answer that made no sense according to German understanding of resistance organization. They reported directly to Madame André, who commanded all Maquis operations across the Auvergne region. When pressed for details about the male commanders above her, the prisoners looked confused. There were no commanders above her. She coordinated weapon drops, planned attacks, distributed ammunition, led combat operations. The interrogator's report, forwarded to Gestapo headquarters that evening, noted this claim with skepticism. Prisoners assert female commander directs regional Maquis operations. Assessment: either sophisticated disinformation or prisoners provided false information under stress. Female operational command at stated scale contradicts all intelligence regarding resistance organizational patterns. 2 days later, a second captured Maquis fighter provided nearly identical testimony during separate interrogation 30 kilometers away. He described Hélène, who'd personally led the raid on his unit's target, cycled between cells delivering orders, and commanded what he estimated as several thousand fighters. The interrogator, unaware of the previous report, filed similar skeptical assessment. But when both reports reached Sturmbannführer Müller's analysis division in Lyon, the pattern demanded attention. Cross-referencing began immediately. Müller's team compared these testimonies against 18 months of intelligence on La Souris Blanche. The names matched aliases from previous investigations. Madame André. Hélène, the White Mouse. Physical descriptions from prisoners matched surveillance photographs from Marseille in 1943. Operational patterns matched White Mouse activities. The timeline was consistent. She'd fled France in late 1943, would have completed SOE training by early 1944. Parachute insertion would explain her sudden appearance in Auvergne in late April. The conclusion was inescapable but professionally devastating. The woman they'd been hunting for 18 months, the legend they'd dismissed as composite myth in February, had returned to France and assumed command of the largest Maquis force in southern France. The final confirmation came from the most humiliating source possible. On July 3rd, a Waffen SS patrol captured documents during a raid on a Maquis supply cache. Among the papers was an RAF communication confirming a scheduled weapon drop for Hélène, freelance team, Auvergne sector. British military personnel files captured earlier in the war included SOE organizational structure. Cross-reference revealed freelance as an SOE operational team designation. Further investigation uncovered that Nancy Wake, identified in Gestapo files as Henri Fioca's wife and known associate of the Pat O'Leary escape line, had been recruited by British SOE. The pieces assembled into a picture German intelligence had explicitly ruled impossible in their February assessment. The woman they'd tortured, Henri Fioca, trying to locate, had not only survived but returned to France with British training and military authority. She was personally coordinating the 7,000 Maquis fighters, causing catastrophic damage across the Auvergne. The 5 million franc bounty they'd placed on a courier had been hunting a military commander whose operational effectiveness exceeded that of many Wehrmacht colonels. The revelation created a crisis within Wehrmacht command structure that had nothing to do with military capability and everything to do with ideology colliding with operational reality. The initial response from Gestapo leadership was outright denial. Oberfuhrer Klaus Barbie reportedly rejected the conclusion when first presented, demanding additional verification despite overwhelming evidence. The assessment that one woman commanded 7,000 fighters in sustained military operations contradicted not just intelligence assumptions, but foundational Nazi beliefs about female capabilities. German military doctrine, built on Prussian tradition and reinforced by National Socialist ideology, held that women lacked the psychological constitution for command under combat stress. They could serve as nurses, communications operators, administrative staff. But combat leadership required masculine qualities German military theory considered biologically determined. Yet here was undeniable evidence. Interrogation testimonies from multiple prisoners who'd never communicated, captured documents from British sources, operational pattern analysis showing coordinated attacks across vast territory, all pointing to the same conclusion. Nancy Wake commanded the Auvergne Maquis. The propaganda problem proved equally intractable. How could Wehrmacht explain to German soldiers that partisan forces killing them were led by an Australian woman? How could they explain to the German public that the Gestapo's most wanted person, hunted for 18 months at enormous expense, was a female SOE agent? The ideological implications threatened morale already strained by Soviet advances in the East and Allied landings in Normandy. If one woman could lead thousands of fighters in successful operations against German forces, what did that suggest about Nazi theories of racial and gender superiority? The official response was suppression. Directive 6634, issued July 15th from Wehrmacht High Command, specified that all intelligence reports regarding resistance leadership in southern France would refer to partisan command elements without gender specification. The directive's language was careful to avoid explicit acknowledgement. To maintain operational focus and prevent speculation that may impact troop morale, all references to enemy command personnel will employ standard military terminology. This directive applies to all reports, briefings, and communications regarding anti-partisan operations. Frontline soldiers, however, couldn't be controlled through directives. Word spread rapidly among Wehrmacht units in the Auvergne. The resistance leader they faced was a woman. Some soldiers refused to believe it, insisting it was Allied propaganda. Others accepted it with grudging professional respect, focusing on tactical threat rather than gender. A few requested transfers, unwilling to admit being outfought by a female commander. While German command struggled with revelation and its implications, Nancy Wake continued operations without pause or awareness of the crisis her existence had created for Wehrmacht ideology. On June 22nd, the same day German interrogators first captured testimony about her command role, she was coordinating a three-cell attack on German positions near Vichy. 200 fighters under her direction destroyed a supply convoy carrying ammunition to frontline units desperately short of artillery shells. She personally led the assault element that blocked the convoy's escape route, firing a Sten gun she'd carried since her SOE training. The operation killed 18 German soldiers and destroyed enough ammunition to supply a battalion for 3 days. Her perspective on being discovered was characteristically pragmatic when she learned of it weeks later through captured German documents brought by Maquis intelligence. She had not been fighting to prove women could command. She'd been fighting to kill fascists and liberate France. Whether Germans knew her gender, whether they accepted or denied it, made no difference to the explosives her Maquis placed under their railways or the bullets they fired into German convoys. By the time Wehrmacht confirmed her identity and role, she had been operating in France for 73 days and coordinated 62 separate attacks involving her 7,000 fighters. The discovery changed nothing operationally. Her Maquis continued attacking, Germans continued dying, and the 5 million franc bounty remained uncollected. After Allied victory in Europe, Soviet and Western interrogators collected testimonies from thousands of German prisoners of war, documenting their experiences across every front and theater. When interrogators asked about resistance operations in France, unexpected patterns emerged in responses from soldiers who'd served in southern sectors. Even hardened Wehrmacht veterans and Waffen-SS officers showed visible discomfort discussing partisan operations in the Auvergne region. The consistency across hundreds of interviews was remarkable. These were men who'd faced Soviet armies, who'd fought through Normandy, who'd survived the Eastern Front's brutality. But when asked about the French resistance in south-central France during 1944, their testimonies revealed something that had shaken their confidence more than conventional military defeat. They'd been systematically outfought by irregular forces led by a woman they'd never managed to locate, much less capture. Hauptmann Friedrich Dörner, Wehrmacht 157th Reserve Division, captured near Lyon in August 1944, provided testimony that exemplified the pattern. We knew partisan strength in our sector was significant, perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 based on attack patterns. Command told us these were disorganized bands, remnants of defeated French army, criminals. We encountered coordinated military operations. Attacks came simultaneously at multiple locations, forcing us to disperse forces. Supply convoys were ambushed with professional tactics, blocking force, assault element, withdrawal routes planned. This wasn't rabble with rifles. These were trained soldiers, executing textbook operations. After one engagement in July, we captured a partisan who revealed under interrogation that their entire regional force, he claimed 7,000 fighters, was commanded by a British agent. A woman. I didn't believe it. Command didn't believe it. But the coordination we faced required professional military leadership. Whether that leader was male or female became irrelevant. We were losing. Oberleutnant Hans Richter, Gestapo intelligence officer assigned to counter-resistance operations in the Auvergne, offered more detailed perspective during his 1946 interrogation. The White Mouse file consumed our section from late 1942 onwards. 5 million francs bounty, our highest priority target. We knew she'd fled France in 1943. When resistance operations intensified dramatically in May 1944, we didn't immediately connect it to her possible return. The scale of coordination seemed impossible for recently inserted agents. We estimated at least a regimental staff worth of personnel would be required to direct forces of that size. Our informant networks produced nothing. Radio detection found no SOE transmissions in the region. We raided suspected command locations repeatedly, found abandoned campsites, but never personnel or documents. It was like fighting a phantom. When captured partisans finally revealed she commanded the entire Auvergne-Maquis, I was ordered to prepare assessment for headquarters. I reviewed our casualties, over 400 killed or wounded in her operational area. Material losses, hundreds of vehicles, thousands of tons of supplies. German troop strength diverted to counter her operations. Approximately 2,000 soldiers pulled from frontline service. All this caused by one woman and the forces she commanded. My assessment concluded she represented the most cost-effective military asset deployed against us in France. Berlin didn't want that assessment distributed. The testimonies revealed grudging professional respect mixed with lingering disbelief. Feldwebel Otto Hartmann, who'd served as convoy security commander, described specific encounters. My convoys were attacked 7 times between May and August 1944. 3 times we fought off the attacks with casualties on both sides. 4 times we were overwhelmed, lost vehicles and cargo. The tactics were consistent. Ambush positions prepared hours in advance. Multiple firing positions, withdrawal routes covered by support elements. After the war, I learned from Allied intelligence that these operations were coordinated by the same woman, this Nancy Wake. She apparently commanded thousands. It explained the coordination we couldn't understand during the fighting. You don't want to believe one person could cause that much damage, but the evidence was clear in our casualty reports. Nancy Wake learned of these testimonies years after the war through historians researching SOE operations and German responses. Her reaction, documented in later interviews, revealed the same pragmatic focus that had characterized her wartime operations. She noted that German soldiers' surprise at being commanded by a woman reflected their own limitations, not hers. She'd led 7,000 Maquis fighters, not to challenge gender assumptions, but because the situation demanded leadership, and she'd been trained to provide it. The testimonies confirmed what she'd known during the fighting. Properly trained soldiers executing sound tactics would defeat enemy forces regardless of their commander's gender. Her operational record spoke clearly enough. 62 major operations coordinated across 4 months. Over 400 German casualties inflicted. 2,000 enemy soldiers diverted from frontline positions. Countless tons of supplies destroyed. Vehicles disabled. Communications severed. All achieved by forces she commanded through personal presence, memorized coordination, and tactical competence that German prisoners acknowledged in testimonies they gave reluctantly. The testimonies confirmed what Germans had discovered too late. The woman they'd hunted with a 5 million franc bounty wasn't a courier or propaganda myth. She was among the most effective resistance leaders deployed in France, and Nancy Wake had accomplished it by proving that command required competence, courage, and commitment, not gender. When Allied forces liberated France in August 1944, Nancy Wake's operational record stood as testament to what German intelligence had dismissed as impossible in their February assessment. The woman Gestapo had hunted with a 5 million franc bounty, the highest price ever placed on an Allied agent's head, had spent 4 months commanding the Auvergne-Maquis in sustained combat operations that altered the strategic equation in southern France. Her final statistics defied the assumptions that had allowed Klaus Barbie to dismiss her as myth or decoy. From her parachute insertion on April 29th through France's liberation in late August, Wake coordinated 78 separate operations involving the 7,000 Maquis fighters under her command. Those operations included 23 supply convoy ambushes, 17 infrastructure demolitions targeting railways and communications, 14 raids on German installations, and 24 coordinated attacks involving multiple cells striking simultaneously across wide geographic areas. The damage inflicted was catastrophic to German logistics and morale. Over 800 German casualties, killed or wounded, 417 vehicles destroyed or disabled, 123 tons of ammunition and supplies destroyed, 87 kilometers of railway and telegraph lines demolished. Her forces captured or killed German personnel at a rate that required Wehrmacht to divert 2 full battalions, approximately 1,600 soldiers, from desperately needed frontline defensive positions to security duties attempting to counter her operations. The human cost of those 4 months was written in her body and mind. She'd cycled over 1,400 kilometers through occupied territory, often covering 40 to 60 kilometers in a single day, to coordinate operations across dispersed cells. She'd personally led attacks on 6 German installations, firing weapons in direct combat. She'd made the famous 500-kilometer bicycle journey in 72 hours to restore communications after her radio operator lost his equipment. She survived on minimal sleep, averaged 4 hours nightly during peak operational periods. The constant movement, the pressure of commanding thousands in combat operations where mistakes meant deaths, the knowledge that Gestapo was actively hunting her with resources no other agent faced, all combined into sustained stress that would have broken most soldiers within weeks. She endured it for 4 months without relief, without rotation, without the support infrastructure regular military commanders took for granted. Her 7,000 fighters followed her, not because of written orders or formal rank, but because she'd earned their trust through shared danger and demonstrated competence. That kind of leadership, built entirely on personal authority rather than institutional structure, required her physical presence continuously. She couldn't delegate command through radio or written orders. She had to be there, personally, repeatedly, creating the human connections that made formless organization function. To understand the magnitude of Wake's achievement, comparison provides essential context. Most SOE agents operated as individuals or in small teams, providing intelligence, conducting sabotage, or coordinating supply drops. They commanded nothing larger than small cells, typically 5 to 15 people. Nancy Wake commanded 7,000. Regular army colonels commanded regiments of similar size but with extensive support. Staff officers for planning, communications equipment for coordination, supply chains for logistics, medical services for casualties, formal ranks that established clear authority. Wake had none of those institutional advantages. She commanded through memory, presence, and personal relationships. The closest comparison in resistance operations was Tito's Yugoslav partisans, but Tito commanded from established headquarters with radio communications and formal military structure. Wake operated without those supports. In conventional military terms, she functioned as regimental commander without a regiment's infrastructure, achieving coordination that Wehrmacht considered impossible without formal systems. The 7,000 fighters she led inflicted damage requiring German response, equivalent to facing a full division. Yet she achieved it with resources that wouldn't supply a single Wehrmacht battalion for a month. The Special Operations Executive's operations across France validated Churchill's vision of unconventional warfare, supporting conventional military operations. Between June 1940 and August 1944, SOE inserted approximately 430 agents into France, supplied thousands of tons of weapons and explosives, and coordinated with resistance forces estimated at over 200,000 fighters at peak strength. The cost was significant, but manageable, approximately £43 million total for all SOE operations across all theaters during the entire war. The returns were extraordinary. SOE and resistance operations in France destroyed infrastructure worth billions, killed or wounded tens of thousands of German soldiers, and most critically forced Germany to maintain occupation forces in France that could have reinforced defensive positions in Normandy or the Eastern Front. Wehrmacht deployed over 300,000 troops to occupation and security duties in France alone. Troops desperately needed elsewhere. The cost-benefit analysis was devastating from the German perspective. Britain spent millions supporting resistance. Germany spent billions trying to suppress it. The asymmetry was strategic, not just tactical. Nancy Wake personally embodied this asymmetric effectiveness with numbers that Wehrmacht logistics officers documented with grudging accuracy in post-war casualty analyses. German expenditure directly related to operations against her forces. 2 battalions maintained for counterinsurgency at operational cost of approximately 4 million Reichsmarks over 4 months. Ammunition expended in combat with her Maquis estimated at 6 million additional Reichsmarks. Casualties requiring medical treatment and replacement personnel adding 3 million Reichsmarks. Material losses from successful attacks reaching 12 million Reichsmarks in destroyed vehicles and supplies. Total German cost, approximately 25 million Reichsmarks attempting to suppress one woman and the 7,000 fighters she commanded. British investment enabling her operations, perhaps £200,000 for her training, insertion, and supply drops, equivalent to 2.4 million Reichsmarks. The cost ratio was 10 to 1, and that calculation didn't include the strategic value of German troops diverted from frontline combat or the psychological impact of German soldiers realizing they'd been outfought by forces commanded by the woman they'd hunted for 2 years. The 5 million franc bounty that once seemed extravagant now appeared economically justified. Capturing or killing Nancy Wake would have been worth far more than 5 million francs based solely on resource calculations. But the Gestapo never came close, despite 18 months of searching. After liberation, Nancy Wake faced challenges no military training had prepared her for. Returning to peace after months of sustained combat command. The French government awarded her the Légion d'honneur and Croix de Guerre, with multiple palms. Britain gave her the George Medal for gallantry and made her a companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. The United States awarded her the Medal of Freedom. She learned only after the war that her husband Henri had been captured by Gestapo, tortured for months, and executed for refusing to reveal her location. A loss that haunted her for the rest of her life. She briefly worked for British intelligence after the war, then attempted to return to Australia, but found civilian life impossible after what she'd experienced. She described feeling like a ghost in peacetime, unable to explain to people who'd never faced combat what those 4 months in France had demanded. She married RAF officer John Forward in 1957, moved between Australia and Britain repeatedly, never quite settling. She wrote her autobiography in 1985, finally telling the story she'd kept private for 40 years. She ran for Australian Parliament twice, unsuccessfully, frustrated by politics that seemed trivial compared to the life and death decisions she'd made commanding the Maquis. For decades, Nancy Wake's story remained relatively unknown outside military history circles, despite her remarkable achievements. The Cold War made Western audiences skeptical of claims about resistance effectiveness, often dismissing them as Allied propaganda, exaggerating partisan impact. SOE records remained classified for years, preventing historians from documenting operations with archival evidence. Wake herself was reluctant to discuss her wartime experiences in detail, uncomfortable with attention and grieving for the husband she'd lost. Recognition came slowly and incompletely. Britain acknowledged her contributions through medals, but not public recognition. Australia was remarkably slow, not appointing her as Companion of the Order of Australia until 2004, 60 years after her operations in France. Only after the Cold War ended did historians gain access to German archives that validated Allied accounts of resistance operations. Wehrmacht casualty reports, logistics assessments, and Gestapo intelligence files confirmed that resistance forces, and Wake specifically, had inflicted the damage Allied accounts claimed. German POW testimonies provided independent verification that couldn't be dismissed as Allied propaganda. Modern recognition came late, but eventually with appropriate scope. Museums in France, Britain, and Australia now feature her story. Monuments in the Auvergne region honor her and the Maquis fighters she commanded. Multiple biographies document her life and operations. She died in 2011 at age 98, one of the last surviving SOE agents from wartime operations. Her ashes were scattered in France near Montluçon, the region where she'd commanded the Maquis, at her request. The ceremony included French veterans who'd fought under her command 67 years earlier, men who remembered the Australian woman who'd led them in combat and earned their loyalty through courage and competence that transcended any gender assumptions. The story of Nancy Wake and the 7,000 Maquis fighters she commanded transcends its historical moment to reveal universal principles about warfare, leadership, and human determination. The Germans' fundamental error wasn't tactical or technological, but conceptual. They built counterinsurgency doctrine on assumptions about how organizations must function, assumptions derived from their own military culture and reinforced by ideological beliefs about gender and capability. Those assumptions created blind spots that Wake exploited mercilessly. German intelligence couldn't track an organization that existed primarily in memory and personal relationships. Radio detection couldn't locate communications that happened through face-to-face meetings. Document discovery couldn't dismantle a network that carried nothing written. Gestapo couldn't infiltrate command structure built on trust earned through shared combat. Every German advantage, every sophisticated tool and procedure developed through years of successful operations proved useless against an enemy who simply didn't function according to the patterns those tools were designed to detect. The broader lesson extends beyond World War II resistance operations. Asymmetric warfare succeeds by forcing opponents to fight in ways their advantages become irrelevant or counterproductive. Wake understood intuitively what modern military theorists now formalize. Technological superiority matters less than operational adaptability, and determined forces operating within their strengths can defeat stronger enemies constrained by their own assumptions. The 7,000 Maquis fighters she commanded weren't better equipped than Wehrmacht soldiers hunting them. They were better led, better motivated, and fighting on terms they chose. Wake's refusal to operate according to German expectations about resistance organization made her impossible to counter using methods that had successfully destroyed every other major network. Her leadership style, born from necessity and enabled by SOE training, created the first truly formless military organization, one that couldn't be dismantled because it had no structure to attack. On that morning, in March 1944, when SS Sturmbannführer Klaus Barbie stood before his officers, laughing at reports of a woman commanding partisan forces, dismissing La Souris Blanche as myth, or at most a courier for male leaders, he represented every fatal assumption that would cost Germany France. The woman he couldn't imagine commanding anything would personally coordinate operations involving 7,000 fighters, inflict casualties requiring 2 German battalions to counter, and survive 4 months of intensive combat operations that should have killed her a dozen times over. She did it by proving that courage doesn't require the newest equipment, that leadership doesn't require formal infrastructure, and that determination makes doctrine irrelevant. Her 7,000 fighters weren't just a military force, they were proof that Germans had calculated everything except the variable that mattered most: the refusal to accept impossible as limitation. And in operations Gestapo never detected, from positions they couldn't locate, through methods their systems couldn't track, Nancy Wake commanded a war The Germans never understood they were losing until France was liberated, and she'd already disappeared into the victory she'd helped create.